Hey, listeners of the Bio Report. Before we get started this week, I wanted to tell you about the digital library from Deep Dive. How much time does your team spend looking for research papers? Google, PubMed, social media. There's got to be a better way. You can now search a reference database of 100 million scientific papers and read the full text of 20 million articles, annotate them, and share with colleagues. It's the smarter way to do research. Here's the best part. If you're like me and been frustrated by not being able to access articles you find because they're behind a paywall, I've got good news. With Deep Dive, you get one-stop affordable research. If you're a listener of the Bio Report, you can try the enterprise version of the service for free for 1 month. Go to deepdive.com/podcast and enter the code BioReport. That's Deep Dive, DeepDive.com/podcast. And the code is BioReport, one word, all caps. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Sumitomo Dainippon Pharma's $3 billion transaction with Roivant Sciences, which gave rise to Sumitovant, represents an effort by the Japanese drug company to make the drug development process faster and more efficient. A critical piece of this effort is steps it's taken to harness information technology to capitalize on existing knowledge to inform decision-making. We spoke to Bill McMahon, Chief Algorithmic Analytics Officer at Sumitovant, about the approach the company is taking, the way it uses information technology to improve the drug development process, and how the subsidiary may be influencing the way its parent company operates. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Daniel, thanks for inviting me on the show.
We're going to talk about Sumitovant, its business model, and its efforts to better harness available data to speed drug development and improve decision-making around it. Perhaps we can begin with a little background. People may be familiar with Vivek Ramaswamy and his Vants. Sumitovant was actually born out of Sumitomo Dainippon Pharma's acquisition of 5 Vants. What is Sumitovant, and where does it sit in relation to Sumitomo and the group of Vants it acquired?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Sumitovant was formed out of a $3 billion transaction between Dainippon Sumitomo Pharma and Roivant. So, Dainippon Sumitomo is a mid-sized Japanese pharma company. Roivant is a startup pharmaceutical company about six years old. So, Roivant has been successful at in-licensing drugs and therapies, refining their clinical development plan to optimize their positioning to address unmet need, raising external capital to support the clinical development plan, then hiring an executive team to execute that clinical development plan. So when a drug was expected to address high unmet need, Roivant spun off a subsidiary to house the drug, generally named with the suffix Vant. So DSP, Dainippon Sumitomo, purchased Roivant's ownership stake in 5 of those subsidiaries, and also 2 technology teams, Digital Innovation, headed by Dan Rothman, and my computational research team with our computational ecosystem that we've branded the drug on. So Sumitovant is the parent company of the 5 subsidiaries whose ownership stake from Roivant was acquired by DSP. And it is Sumitovant is a wholly owned subsidiary of DSP. So we have basically a 2-prong role, or 3-prong role, really. So the first is as a governance company of the 5 subsidiaries. And second, to support the digital transformation of DSP through the 2 technology teams. And then finally, we were acquired with the intent to be a growth engine of DSP's U.S. pipeline.
Oh, to what extent has Sumitomo embraced the original vision behind the Vant strategy, and to what extent has it altered it?
So I think there are multiple components of the Vant strategy. Within Roivant itself, there was a substantial component of externalizing the financial sources associated with clinical development. So I would say that that aspect has the emphasis on it has been reduced as part of Sumitovant. But the other component of Roivant that I would say has been fairly successful is aligning people's incentives with their, the principal objective. And so that the advanced subsidiaries ensure that focused executive teams are executing the clinical development plans that have been sort of optimized for the drugs that are a part of Vant. And that has persisted within Sumitovant in our subsidiary structure.
And does Sumitovant act more as a portfolio manager and investor than a traditional drug developer? And is there an ideal size to fully leverage this approach? Is there a sweet spot in terms of the capital size or the pipeline that you're developing?
I don't know that we've reached the state where we can know what is the optimal portfolio size for this approach. But I would say so. We come from both a portfolio management perspective, but also from the perspective the people who are within Sumitovant have fairly extensive experience within their particular domains, and they can support when we observe that there may be additional leverage that experience can bring to the table in terms of driving efficiencies within the execution of the clinical development plans or commercialization with Vant. Then we can rapidly bring that experience to bear to support the clinical development or the commercial execution within the Vant. So so we end up with a dual role where we oversee the portfolio to some extent, but we also support the successful execution of that portfolio.
And collectively, how big is the platform it oversees today? And is it agnostic to indications and modalities, or is there some underlying focus?
So in this case, we have two drugs that are undergoing commercialization right now. So Myovant, which is not a wholly owned subsidiary of Sumitovant, but a publicly traded company with a majority-owned stake by Sumitovant. They are in the process of commercializing relugolix for prostate cancer, and they're expected to get approved for endometriosis and uterine fibroids over the next year. In addition to Myovant, so Urovant is in the process of commercializing Vibegron for overactive bladder. We also have Altavant, which has two drugs, one focused on pulmonary arterial hypertension and another focused on bronchiolitis obliterans syndrome. And we also have Spirovant, which is has a gene therapy that is preclinical for cystic fibrosis, and Enzavant, which recently got approval for its therapy to treat complete DiGeorge syndrome or complete congenital athymia. But my team, the Drugome team, has a broader mandate. So we actually also work with Synovion, who has a commercial stage drug, Latuda, but also drugs both in clinical development and a preclinical stage. And we also work with Sumitomo Dainippon Pharma Oncology, which is the U.S. subsidiary that was created out of Tolero, an oncology drug discovery company. and Boston Biomedical, which was a clinical stage oncology company. So, and we also work with Dainippon Sumitomo themselves and do supportive analyses within their portfolio of drugs in Japan.
And are there shared functions across the different organizations, or are all of the organizations doing all of the functions you would find at any individual biopharmaceutical company?
I would say it's a bit of a complex question. There are certain aspects, there are certain things that are shared across all of the different entities, and then there are other pieces which only exist at a particular entity. So like drug discovery, there's oncology-focused drug discovery. Uh, there is, I would say, joint interaction between SDPO and groups within DSP, and the overall oversight of spend that resides with DSP. But then there are but then there are other groups that are purely focused at the particular at their particular subsidiary.
10 years ago, I don't think you could find someone in a biopharmaceutical company with your title, Chief Algorithmic Analytics Officer. How do you describe your role within Sumitovant?
So that's a good question. I'll preface that by talking a little bit about my background. So I actually got my PhD in computational physics. So my advisor had a joint appointment in physics and electrical and computer engineering. The focus of my work was actually simulation of electrochemical reactions far from equilibrium. So integrating full band structure, Monte Carlo simulation of electronic transport with density functional calculations of defect bond energies and scattering rate equations related to electrochemical interactions. So my first industry job was in the semiconductor industry, where that experience was, I'd say, highly relevant. And there we were focused on technology development to extend Moore's law. I was working at Intel at first. So what I observed at Intel, so the focus was primarily developing a manufacturing process that would reliably produce the next generation of integrated circuits. It was fundamentally clear that the infrastructure of data-driven decision-making was critical to the success of this like very technology forward and very complex process. But it is an infrastructure involved in data-driven decision-making. There are designed, standardized experiments. There's a host of measurement apparatuses of all types. There's integration of those measurement apparatuses with data storage facilities. There are databases. There's code to extract data from the databases. There's standardized code repositories and libraries of code to build analyses, right? So when I came to pharma, what I observed, I was brought in to sort of rationalize the data-driven decision-making of the business development process. For Roivant, that meant primarily valuing drugs for potential in-licensing. And what I observed was largely individuals making individual decisions based on the best available data that happened to be in front of them. And frequently, it involved a lot of Googling, a lot of reading papers, and fairly extensive curation efforts. And so what I have tried to bring to bear, at first within Roivant, now within Sumitovant, was bringing that data-driven decision-making analytical infrastructure, creating that in a pharma context to ensure that strategic decisions around drug value can be made in a data-driven way. And so that was why when I joined Sumitovant, I came up with the title that I did, because the intent is not just to do analytics, but to ensure that the data is in place for analytics to be done by people who are in the right place to make the right decisions to drive the company forward.
There's no shortage of data around drugs, whether it's molecular information, clinical trials data, or real-world evidence. What's the challenge to tapping into all of those disparate sources of data and extracting actionable information? And how do you, given your background, know how to weigh those different pieces of information and how to make sure you're tapping ones that bring in value to decision making?
Yeah, so I would say the aspect of that ensures that I am able to do that is by maintaining a focus on the fundamental problem of understanding the value of a drug in the marketplace. And so whenever I engage with a group for whom my team can provide analytics, fundamentally it's to an eye, what can the tools that we have actually deliver efficiency to that team, and or if we are creating new tools in support of a team's business problem, do those help us to better value drugs in the marketplace? And so I would say that data within biopharma is incredibly heterogeneous. So there's a couple of aspects that I would say my team has become most familiar with. So one is that there's the structured data, and that is the data that can go into a relational database and that data scientists can query and analyze with simplified code or with simple code. And then separately, there's the unstructured data, which generally means just text in documents. So the data that my team has the most facility with is the data that supports epidemiology and curation in support of asset valuation. So I would say from my somewhat of an outsider perspective, epidemiology has been fundamentally transformed by the introduction and availability of de-identified electronic medical records and claims. They're fundamental to nearly all aspects of pharma. And I believe much of the success of my team in delivering business value across all of these different subsidiaries has been because we went hard early at integrating the analysis of claims data into as many pharma business problems as we could. And it's still very common for us to engage with a new team who has potentially a fairly standard epidemiological question, and they still don't know where they would have gone. And we show them what you can do with electronic claims, and we provide them answers very, very quickly. But then there's also unstructured data, and that's an area that we've also driven fairly hard at. So fundamentally, for many questions in pharma, it is difficult to get to a place other than where you have an analyst, and that analyst Googles some text and reads some papers. So trying to identify and make more efficient wherever such a process occurs is principal to my team's approach. In that direction, we've had to build up a natural language processing architecture that enables us to rapidly create and deploy natural language processing models to targeted subsets of documents to extract results that we believe to be more complete than the traditional analyst Googling a specific problem. And we've applied that infrastructure in competitive intelligence through the organization, but throughout the organization, but particularly to executives in the business development process. But we're also applying it to support drug discovery and ensure focus of drug discovery process on high promise targets, which, through our extraction of information for the literature and the combination of that data with data that we have from structured data sources, we know to be of high potential value to the company. So we believe that this ultimately makes the overall organization smarter.
Along the way, has there been any surprising indicator of value?
That is a very good question. I think the biggest surprise when I first came into pharma, there are a couple of big surprises. One of the first big surprises is that large pharma companies generally don't develop their own drugs or don't discover their own drugs. They generally in-license drugs from earlier stage biotech companies. But one of the other surprise was within Roivant, one of the highest cost items in terms of developing a drug is the phase 3 clinical trial. And so I dug in fairly early in my time at Roivant to understand what it is about clinical trials, what are the actual driving factors in the overall cost of a phase 3 trial. And I ended up developing a clinical trial cost model to understand that cost. And what I found for a large fraction of indications, and probably the majority of phase 3 clinical trials, the cost is the principal component of the cost. The majority of the cost is not driven by doctors treating or measuring patients. The majority of the cost is actually associated with the management and coordination of across all of the different sites that are a component of the clinical trial. And so fundamentally, if you want to substantially improve the overall cost of a clinical trial, a large fraction of that is ensuring that you have rapid enrollment in that clinical trial, because a faster enrollment ensures that you reduce the overall overhead associated with managing the sites, and then that actually represents, in most cases, the majority of the costs associated with the trial.
As part of Sumitomo's acquisition, it got Roivant's technology platforms. The first of this is the drugome. What is the drugome, and how does it work?
So the drugome is the name, I would say, the brand that we've given to the ecosystem of data, which is a combination of text documents and subscription data sources, publicly available data sources, the code that we have built and the databases that we've built to house that data, the code repositories that store the algorithmic analyses that we have done to utilize that data to answer strategic questions within pharma. And the graphical user interfaces that we've built for the standardized analyses that we've done. So I would say that the thing that usually appeals to a lot of people when discussing the drugome is the graphical user interfaces and the ability of individuals to kind of browse around with our data sets. But practically speaking, for individual analysts, most frequently their questions are too complex to answer within a GUI that we have set up to access the data. And so the most useful function for what we do is to basically use our repository of code and our repository of techniques combined with the expertise of the individuals on my team to synthesize new analyses, bespoke analyses that satisfy specific strategic questions of interest.
Well, how does that actually used in practice to inform decision making? And is it essentially given a decision maker a value or a value range of a particular asset they're considering acquiring?
So I would say one of the advantages that I have had, so in Sumitovant in particular, because I report directly into Myrtle, our CEO, and because of our aggressive interactions across the ecosystem or across the family of DSP companies, I have fairly high visibility into what are the important strategic questions across that family of companies. And as a result, I have both visibility into what we can do and what is important. And I can ensure that my team applies appropriately the resources that are available to us to the questions of high significance that we also are able to provide important feedback on.
And what's been done to validate the system, and how do you alter the inputs or the algorithms as you go?
We built everything from scratch. So we have the capability. So the capabilities that exist on my team contain both computational infrastructure capabilities, which is my own kind of background, but also statistics, pharmaceutical experience, healthcare related backgrounds. Generally, everyone on the team is a coder. Everyone on the team is fluent in math. Essentially, everyone on the team has had a fair amount of pharma experience, and everyone on the team has built substantial expertise on multiple bodies of data. So it is pretty easy for us to ensure that we bring the resources on the team and the expertise on the team and the existing code base to bear on problems of significance.
Is there a kind of case study you can offer of how this was used to actually make a decision?
I would say that we are involved in a broad variety of decisions on an everyday basis. So we work with clinical operations teams, and we've worked with them in the past to provide lists of likely sites of significance that they should target for clinical trials. We have provided lists to business development groups, which incorporate elements like overlap analyses of existing high decile docs with clinical competitiveness within particular indications to get to lists of, say dozens of drugs that are in development for a specific indication or have mechanism of action that is of high interest to particular, is believed to be of high strategic importance within the company. We work with health economics outcome research groups to construct biostatistical analyses and have had multiple publications in the field of HEOR. We help to develop hypotheses around potential sources of drug value and validate those hypotheses within our real world data set. We have helped to select specific oncology related targets for which there's actually drug discovery opportunity and molecule design ongoing. So there's, it's a little bit sensitive to speak to specific results in a business development context due to kind of corporate sensitivity to it. But I mean, our analyses have pretty much touched every aspect of drug development, from drug discovery through commercial launch.
Well, there's a second platform you use. This is the digital innovation platform. What is that, and how is that used?
Sure. So I encourage you to bring in Dan Rothman, who is our Chief Digital Officer and head of the digital innovation effort. He has a dual role of Chief Digital Officer, both Dainippon Sumitomo and with Sumitovant. So I'll just give the high level summary. But I'll start from that with from a conversation that I observed several years back at Artificial Intelligence in Pharma Forum at MIT, actually. So when thought leaders were polled on a panel on how to make data science effective in an organization through a center of excellence or through distributing data science into the individual business units, the thought leaders ended up in a consensus that you really need both. You need the operational discipline that comes from embedded data scientists in business units, but you also need the gurus who have some space to innovate and to develop sort of the deep expertise on data sources that's necessary to to kind of facilitate like expertise on the deep analyses. So digital innovation represents the first piece of that puzzle, ensuring that you have the connectivity of the data scientists and the programmers to the business problems, ensure that can bring innovation to bear on those business functions. And then the drug piece represents the non-embedded piece, the piece where we develop the deep expertise on the data sources and the techniques that enable us to innovate on strategy.
There's been great pressure to improve R&D efficiency in biopharma. How do you leverage the structure you have to keep it efficient rather than duplicating efforts across the different companies?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll touch on three different areas. So there's clinical efficacy of drugs and estimating the clinical efficacy of drugs, generating synthesized understanding of drug value across multiple data sources, and then the use of data to drive clinical trial execution efficiency. So I'd say one of the things about so when you start in assessing the likely value of a drug, you always start with clinical efficacy. there's kind of an obvious absurdity to assessing clinical efficacy. So clinical trial data, even for approved drugs, is primarily only published in journal article form. So presumably the FDA actually has a giant database of SAS files that contained well-structured data for all clinical trials, for all approved drugs. If that structured data were openly available, then a competent data analyst could actually run, and a competent biostatistician could run a meta-analysis in a couple of hours, as opposed to the way that meta-analyses are run right now, which involves hunting down the set of all papers, extracting manually the means of means, and scaling them appropriately for whatever endpoints happen to have been published in the particular published subset of articles. So if the FDA would actually mandate the release of de-identified data files, at least for the approved drugs, then there would be huge efficiency gain for clinical efficacy evaluation specialists. So what we end up doing, what we end up bringing to bear on clinical efficacy is, first, we know where the data is. We know where the structured data is. We make we make that data available as fast as possible. We've built up through interactions with MDs and people who typically assess clinical efficacy. We have the facility to structure that data appropriately. We also can find the papers that would contain clinical efficacy very rapidly, and we also have tools that support our extraction of the efficacy from those papers. So what we bring to bear is, in general, is the data infrastructure that enables us to make that business process of extracting efficacy more efficient. And we can do that within Sumitovant. When Sumitovant is assessing potential indications of interest, we can do that for any business development group across the DSP family companies. So that's on the clinical efficacy side. So the second piece where there are opportunities with respect to data efficiency is with respect to assessing likely value of a drug, which is obviously of importance first when you want to in-license a drug, but pretty much at every stage of a drug. When you are planning out the clinical trial development plan pre-NDA, or when you are optimizing the label post-NDA and defining any particular clinical trial necessary to optimize the label. And so one of the things that we bring to bear there, one of the difficulties in doing that kind of drug valuation process is that the structured data that's available and generally is against different naming ontologies, be that for indications, be that for mechanisms of action, or even drug names themselves. So with respect to indications, the NIH has tried to relate the different ontologies of disease naming to each other through the Unified Medical Language System, UMLS, which we utilize heavily. But very commonly, subscription data sources don't adhere to those naming conventions. They come up with their own disease ontology, which frankly is frequently inferior to the existing ones. So one of the advantages and one of the things that one of the strengths that we have is that we have become expert at integrating naming conventions across these different ontologies. Once you have the expertise in that, then you can construct synthesized analyses across all of those different data sources. So you can connect the competitive intelligence databases with the real world data to come up with a unified approach to overall having a value for the drug. But so I guess the final area I would like to touch with respect to that is the one that you brought up earlier, which is I would say a lot of genomics data, a lot of pathway databases. Like there's a lot of I would say the earlier stage drug data that is spread across a broader way, largely of scientific websites, academic websites. And what we have brought to bear there is, developing the deep expertise, understanding which of the websites are of critical importance for specific questions of interest. And of course, estimating the likelihood of efficacy of a drug is of high relevance, even when a drug is phase 3, because it is not always the case that a pharma company has made good decisions that are strongly based on the science with respect to whether or not a mechanism of action is likely to work in a particular indication. But it's also useful at the earlier stage of drug discovery. But there's still, I would say, we're in the early stages. So the Human Genome Project provided essentially the alphabet of human medical function. And we are, I'd say, in the early stages of building, the pathways, the molecular pathways that represent, say, the words that are built out of that alphabet. And then ultimately, in order for us to understand overall human function, we need to lace together the alphabet with the words, with the sentences, cellular expression of different genes, the use of that cellular expression in different tissue types, the entire role of those different tissue types in various organs, and ultimately the implications of the overall human function for specific indications. We're in the early stages of building the type of data tool that would enable you to dig into that overall database of human function and understand it in the context of the application of a specific drug to that human function. So that's ultimately what we're trying to build out, and connecting that to the value of a specific drug is what I believe will ultimately enable Sumitovant to have a strategic advantage in the drug development process.
I understand the case for having focused, specialized, and highly incentivized teams doing the development of particular assets, but one of the most costly decisions is not killing a program when it should be killed. How is decision-making handled with regards to advancing or killing a program?
So I would speak. So generally, it is of importance anytime that a subsidiary intends to either investigate a new indication or bring a drug to the next clinical phase, that there's an overall evaluation process to ensure that not just from whether or not the drug will work perspective, but also from the impact on the label, the commercial efficacy of the drug, or the commercial opportunity for the drug, whether or not the investment at that stage is ultimately an investment that is one that the company should make. And so Sumitovant has worked to establish a governance process to ensure that we holistically look across all of those elements at the stages where a large capital commitment will end up being needed to take the drug forward.
Ultimately, how do you see these technology platforms differentiating the company or giving it an edge over competitors?
So that's where it ultimately is up to us to apply the platforms to ensure that we have a data-driven decision-making process. As I indicated in my past experience within the semiconductor industry, it was clear that as long as you establish the infrastructure to ensure that decision making is data driven, it is certainly helpful if you have senior management that is highly experienced and is going to try to make good decisions. But if the infrastructure is in place such that the decisions are data driven, then that means that the decisions that are made are going to be better. And the way that you build a durable competitive advantage for a company is to ensure that the processes that you have can continue delivering effective results, even when regardless of the people that are in place to execute those processes. So I would say the evolution of Sumitovant to some extent from Roivant is to become a more process oriented company. And what I'm trying to ensure, and the leadership of Sumitovant is trying to ensure, is that the processes that we are putting in place with respect to managing the overall portfolio guarantee that we are making good decisions with respect to that portfolio.
Bill McMahon, Chief Algorithmic Analytics Officer of Sumitovant. Bill, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.